U.S. Navy ships. In this lecture, we'll be covering shipboard construction techniques and Navy terminology. At the end of this lecture series, you'll be able to identify Navy ships, shipboard terminology, and understand how our Navy ships are used to fulfill the Navy's mission. Objectives: explain mission of Navy ships, explain shipboard construction and terminology. Sailors on board ship use a lot of specialized terminology that is specific to maritime use. A lot of these terminology is not specific to just U.S. Navy, but they're a standard terminology used aboard ship for any seafarer, both civilian and military. Let's take a look at the chart to the right of the slide. Civilian language: upstairs is topside, downstairs is below or below deck, floors are decks, ceilings are overheads, walls are called bulkheads, hallways are now called passageways, or we even take that one step farther lots of times in the Navy and call them a P-way, and the bathroom is referred to as the head. You'll be seeing a lot of this type of terminology throughout this lecture series. Here's some more terminology. Front of the ship is the forward part of the ship. The rear part of the ship is the after, or just shortened to aft part of the ships. The crosswise, or crossing the ship in the middle part of the ship, is called athwartships. Athwartships. The very front of the bow, the very front of the ship is referred to as the bow. We're talking about the ship's hull. The very back of the ship's hull is referred to as the stern. Going towards the stern, you're going aft. Going towards the bow, you're going forward. Directions on board the ship. The part of the ship that sets in the water is referred to as the ship's hull. The very front part of the ship's hull, up by the pointy end of the ship, that's referred to as the bow. The very back part of the ship's hull, or the flat end, or on some of our older ships, a rounded edge on the back part of the ship's hull, is referred to as the stern. Direction of movement. If you're going to the front part of the ship, you're going forward on the ship. If you're going to the back part of the ship, you're going to the after, or we just shorten that to the aft part of the ship. Crosswise, if you're crossing the ship going from the what we call the port side to the starboard, or the starboard to the port side, you're going athwartships. If you're on the stern of the ship and you want to go toward the bow, you are going forward. If you are on the bow of the ship and you're wanting to go to the stern, you're going aft. Let's top shipboard construction. The very bottom of the ship, there's a large beam that runs the full length of the ship. This beam is referred to as the keel. This is the backbone of the ship. Think of yourself. Your spinal cord and your backbone runs down the center of your back, and this gives rigidity to you as a human being. This is what allows you to stand upright and gives you strength in your body. You'll also have your rib cage that comes off of your backbone to give your chest cavity some strength where your internal organs are kept. This is also the same way a ship is constructed. So you have the keel, which is like the backbone of the ship, and then you will have what we call frames that will extend out from the keel to give like a rib cage to the ship's hull. This rib cage are called frames. The standard spacing on a U.S. Navy ship between frames is 4 feet. Now to continue on with shipboard construction. Okay, we've got the keel laid and we got frames that are coming out from the keel to give a rib cage for the ship's hull. To complete the hull, we add shell plating, or what is called hull plating, that creates the skin of the ship, and that's what creates the ship's hull. This is the first steps of building the ship. Now, internally to the ship's hull, We will add vertical bulkheads. Bulkheads are, once again, they're like the walls of the ship. Then you'll have horizontal decks that will be placed in the hull to give the ship's hull what we call compartmentation. So you got vertical bulkheads, the walls of the ship, and then the floor of the ship are called decks. Now, once we've added this compartmentation to the ship's hull, we need to be able to get around through the ship. To allow this, we will add watertight doors, as seen pictured in the picture of this slide, to allow access through bulkheads. We will add watertight hatches that you'll see later on in this presentation that allows you access through decks. Now, God bless Commander. Commander's last tour of duty before retirement was an amphibious assault ship, so he hung out with a lot of Marines. So you will hear Commander call both doors and hatches all hatches. Well, that's the way Marine does it because they're low on the slow side. But all good sailors and damage controlmen know that accesses through bulkheads are called doors, accesses through floors are called hatches. All right, let's take a look at the picture in this slide. The picture in the slide is an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. It's one of our modern day destroyers. Now, the part of the ship that sits in the water is referred to as the hull. We already know that. Well, on top of the hull, the very top deck of the hull is referred to as the main deck. If you look at the big boxy area part of the ship sitting on top of the main deck, that is referred to as the ship's superstructure. If you look at the area that the big stanchion staging device that jets up above the ship's superstructure that looks like a cross is called the mast. Now, the mast in old sailing ships, that's where we would hang our sails from to give us propulsion from the wind to push us through the water. Well, modern day ships don't need wind propulsion anymore because we're propelled through the water by diesel, gas turbine, or steam engines. So, but enterprising sailors, we still kept the mast on the ship, and what we hang on the mast now, those cross arms up there on the mast, is where we hang radar equipment, satellite communication equipment, and other devices like that that help us communicate, and it gets us high on the ship so as for better communication. If you look, let's go back and look at the ship's hull, the part of the ship set in the water. The part of the ship that sits in the water, notice where the ship's hull intersects the water. That's called the water line. The distance from the water line up to the main deck is referred to as the freeboard. Now, it's not seen here, but the part of the ship that sits in the water, so in other words, from the water line down to the bottom of the ship, or the keel, is referred to as ship's draft. Decks divide the ship horizontally. We already discussed this briefly earlier in the lecture. Bulkheads are the walls of the ship that go vertical in the ship's hull. Decks go horizontally in the ship's hull. Now, all the decks on board a ship in the U.S. Navy are numbered. The very top deck of the ship's hull is referred to as the main deck. That's deck number 1. The deck next, just below deck number 1, is going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. These bulkheads and decks create compartments on board the ship. These compartments are used everything from berthing compartments, was where we sleep at on board ship, to mess decks where we eat at. That's for enlisted sailors. Now, officers berth in staterooms and they mess in wardrooms, but we all share office spaces, workspaces, machinery spaces, engine rooms, and ordnance spaces, and these all make up a compartmentation system, which we discussed in another lecture. Okay, aboard ship, different parts of the ship can have more than one name. If you look in the picture below in this slide, weather decks. A weather deck is any deck that exposed to the weather. In other words, if you can stand on the deck and you get rained on or snowed on, you're on a weather deck. Other decks that we have on the ship are like flight decks, or main deck. Main deck can be a weather deck. Flight decks can be a weather deck. They can have more than one name. Once again, as a reminder, in this picture here, this is a picture of one of our cruisers. The boxy area of the ship that sits on the main deck is referred to as the superstructure. Remember, the main deck is the uppermost deck of the ship's hull. Now, the decks in the ship's hull are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth, working your way down. In the superstructure, the superstructure, the decks are called levels. O1 level, O2 level, O3 level, and these go in succession, working your way from the main deck. So the first deck away from the main deck is called the O1 level. Just think of one level over the main deck. The second deck up is the O2 level, the second level over the main deck, and so on and so forth. Let's take a look at the aircraft carrier. Now, it's very common, a lot of people think the flight deck of an aircraft carrier is the main deck. That is not true. Actually, on an aircraft carrier, another deck is what they call the hangar bay, or the hangar deck on the aircraft carrier is the actual main deck. That's deck number 1. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier is actually the O4 level. It's 4 decks or 4 levels above the main deck. In this view, you are actually looking into the main deck, the hangar bay or the hangar deck of one of our aircraft carriers. As discussed earlier, when we create this compartmentation on board ship, it creates watertight boundaries, watertight bulkheads, watertight decks. To allow access to these bulkheads and decks, we have watertight doors to allow you to access through bulkheads. You have watertight hatches that allow you to access through the deck. And that's what we have here. The photo on the right side is a picture of a watertight hatch allowing access to the deck. Now that big dark gray object is the watertight hatch. Notice the little round circle that's opened up. That is called a scuttle. That's an escape scuttle. So at different levels of measurement or protection of the ship, we can lower the hatches and open up the scuttles, because the scuttles is easier to secure in an emergency. There's some spaces will also have scuttles mounted on a bulkhead. That's an exception to the rule. So you can have scuttles mounted on the bulkhead or on the deck or in a hatch like you see here. Once again, as we saw earlier, here's another picture of a watertight door. Watertight door mounted in a bulkhead. Now, you'll typically see 2 types of watertight doors. You'll see a quick acting watertight door, like you see here. One lever opens up all the mechanism that allows you to open and close the door. And we have what that mechanism are referred to as dogs. Then we have individually dog doors that won't have that quick acting mechanism that you have to open each individual dog on the door. There's a picture of an individual dog door. Notice the yellow arrows pointing to a little lever. Each one of those letters operates a dog. Now on a quick acting door, you have a mechanism that will relieve or open those dogs all at the same time. On an individual dog door, you have to open them one at a time. This is typically done, you'll start on the hinge side of the door first and work your way around to the center dog opposite the hinges. Here's some more terminology. This picture here We're looking down on top of a destroyer, and the forward part of the main deck on this destroyer is referred to as the forecastle. If you spell it out properly, notice it's spelled forecastle, but it's pronounced the forecastle. Moving around the ship, those other different places you'll come across. This picture here that you see in the slide is the quarterdeck. The quarterdeck on the ship is a ceremonial area that could be in many different positions on a ship. On a lot of our ship, it is established on the fantail, which is backed by the stern of the ship, or it could be established in the hangar bay or the hangar deck of the ship. It could be up on the forecastle. It could be on the O1 level. It could be in a lot of different places. This is what determines this. The quarterdeck is placed at the access point of the ship. This is a ceremonial area. This is where you will leave and return to the ship. Now, large ships like aircraft carriers, large depth amphibious assault ships will actually have two quarterdecks. They will have the main quarterdeck, which will be accessed by visiting dignitaries, visitors, chiefs, and officers. The after quarterdeck is used by enlisted personnel, and this is where contractors will come and go from. Right. Two other common terms that we use when we're talking about ships is ship size. Ship size is normally talked about in displacement. Displacement is how much the ship weighs. U.S. Navy ships are normally weighed in what we refer to as long tons. A long ton is 2,240 pounds. Now, a regular ton is straight up 2,000 pounds. When we're talking about ship speed, we use nautical miles. A nautical mile is just a little bit longer than a land mile. So you will hear an airline pilot's aircraft use the same thing. When you're talking about ship speed, you're talking how fast the ship will travel across the water using nautical miles, and this is called knots. So a ship going 42 knots is a ship that can go 42 nautical miles in 1 hour. Ship identification. Ships are identified by name and designation. USS equals United States Navy ship. This is the designation we give to warships. Nimitz equals, that is the ship's name. Every ship has its own name. CVN, that's what type of ship it is. CV tells me it's an aircraft carrier. N tells me it's a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Nuclear power means what type of propulsion plant it has. In other words, it doesn't tell me it's carrying nuclear weapons, which it very well could be. It's telling me the ship propulsion plant, what makes it go through the water, is powered by nuclear power. 68, that's the hull number. Each ship has its own hull number and designation, and it just so happens the USS Nimitz is number 68. Armament. Armament to a warship is what makes it a warship. It's weapons that it carries, such as guns, rockets, missiles, aircraft. We typically break our weapon systems down in two types of weapon systems: offensive weapons and defensive weapons. Think about a football game. An offensive weapon, when you're on offense in a football game, you're trying to score, so you're trying to make that an attack if you're using your offensive weapons. Defensive weapons, in a football game, you're defending your goal, so a defensive weapon is going to be used to defend your ship. Now, on a lot of our modern day ships today, a lot of our weapons can be used both as offensive and defensive weapons. Questions? We've only scratched the surface. In fact, the next lecture you'll see in this lecture series, what I call Chapter 3, will be continuing the same line of instruction, talking about more shipboard terminology and the way we do business aboard ship, and what we use our ships for. We're going to start talking more in depth about what type of ships we have in the Navy and what their specific uses for. But if you have any questions for so far, please ask now. If you're a KVA cadet, shoot myself or Commander a question on Canvas and we'll get back to you. Master Chief, out.